This morning's lecture is underwritten by the Crawford N. and May Selstrom Barger Lectureship in Business and Economics and by the Robert S. Barger Memorial Lectureship. The Barger family has been deeply involved in Chautauqua for many years. Crawford Barger chaired the Chautauqua Fund Drive for the Jamestown vicinity in the 1930s. His wife May was a pianist who played on the Amphitheater stage. Their son Robert served as an institution trustee and as director of the Chautauqua Foundation. Crawford, May, and Robert's descendants continue to spend their summers on the ground and take leadership in many areas. So please join me in thanking the Barger family. American media often focuses on the United States' relationship to other countries, ignoring other countries' relationships with each other. In this week's series of global topics, we attempt to correct some of this oversight. This morning's lecturer is Deborah Bräutigam, Professor of International Development and Comparative Politics with a focus on China Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. You may know it as SAIS. She will be discussing Chinese investments in Africa, a topic she has studied extensively. She's the author of a book titled The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa, and will be teaching a class this coming spring on China's rapidly growing economic, political, and social ties with African countries. Professor Bräutigam previously served as Associate Professor and Director of the Economics and Political Development Program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She holds a PhD in International Development from Tufts University and is joined on her first visit to Chautauqua by her husband, David Hirschman. The title of Professor Bräutigam's lecture is China and Africa, Think Again. So, ladies and gentlemen, China and Africa enthusiasts and those who will be, please join me in welcoming Deborah Bräutigam to the Chautauqua Amphitheater.
Thank you, Shara, for that kind introduction. That was really wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you to Chautauqua for inviting me here. Of course, this is a place I've known about all my life. It's very, very famous in the world of education and the world of international affairs. So I'm delighted to be here. So let me start. I think for Americans, China's rise is really the most important political and economic issue of our new millennium. And it's something that we need to get right. And I think we're not getting it right in a lot of ways. Getting it right is going to help. There was a recent article in Foreign Affairs that came out in July, and they said that one way to head off unnecessary conflicts with China is to reduce the malign role played by misperceptions. And I think Africa is one place where these misperceptions are particularly strong. Last week, there was a summit on Africa in Washington, D.C., and I guess you're going to hear a little bit more about that later on this week. China was a kind of uninvited guest at that summit. I had a lot of calls from journalists who asked me, what about the role of China? Is that why Obama is holding an Africa summit? And I had to say, yes. China's had its own summits with African leaders. In fact, they had one in 2000, 2003, 2006, 9, 12, and they'll have another one in 2015. Japan has had summits with African leaders. Europe has done it. India has done it. I don't think Brazil has done it yet. But we are late to the table in terms of engaging with African leaders on that. And I think when we do think about China and Africa, which for most Americans is not very often, we tend to do so with some alarm. And we might read The Economist and see its cover on China, the new colonialists, without even a question mark, the new colonialists. We might see an example of a map which is imprinted with the Chinese flag, which suggests that China is taking over Africa. Or we might see a book with a scary dragon on the cover. Now, I've been watching China engage in Africa for a very long time. I first went to Africa in 1983, and this is from Liberia. I promised Shara that I would show her a picture of Liberia, where her daughter's working right now. So in case you can't see me on this, there I am. So I went to Liberia to look at Chinese aid. And because their aid was in the rural areas, I went to the rural areas and I interviewed them there. And here's another picture. So they were working in an agricultural project trying to help Liberians learn how to do irrigated rice in a more high-tech fashion. And I wrote a book about this, and it sank like a stone. In the 1990s, when my book was published, nobody was really very interested in China and Africa. So I continued with my interest and my research. And now I'm very glad to say that there's a lot more interest. And I was in a good position to help navigate this relationship and help Americans understand it better. And so let me tell you a story, once upon a time, which I think helps shape how I see how China sees Africa. And I hope it will help you understand it a little better as well. So once upon a time, there was a very large, very poor, but resource-rich country just emerging from a period of intense conflict. And this country decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure, they said. We need to develop power plants, and we need to modernize our ports. But they didn't have the technology to do that. And soon, they had a visit from a wealthy Asian nation that had already become a major consumer of their oil. And this Asian nation said to them, "We'll make you a bargain. We will give you a line of credit worth $10 billion. Nobody else is coming to give you credit, but we will. And you can use that credit to import technologies from us. Our companies can help you develop your power plants and your harbors, and you can repay us with your oil." Now, many in this poor country were very concerned about this arrangement, and it was debated for several years. But finally, they agreed, and the work started. Now, as you're hearing this story, I imagine you're figuring out who are these countries, right? I mean, this is an educational institution, so you're all well educated, and you've got some pretty good ideas. And if I was with my class, I would now ask, which are the countries? And I would ask people to raise their hands. But I'm just going to let you think about it, and I'm going to guess that you've got one of the countries right? Okay, China. China's in this story. But China's not the country that you're probably thinking it is. China, in this story, is the large, poor country with oil, just emerging from conflict. Now, surprised? The other country is Japan. And the time is the 1970s, when China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. China was not a member of the World Bank or the IMF. They couldn't come to Washington and ask for loans. They certainly couldn't get loans from the international banks, and they wanted to modernize, and Japan was there. Now, I tell you this story because it shapes how the Chinese look at their role in Africa. They're going to countries, many of which are just coming out of conflict, Angola, 25-year civil war. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, war. Guinea-Bissau, war. Sudan, and so on. And they're making the same kind of bargain. And what's more, this finance that the Chinese offer in Africa is not what we would consider foreign aid. These large lines of credit are commercial. They're at commercial rates. They're not subsidized by the government. But in order to reduce the risks, they are secured with exports. And it doesn't have to be exports of oil. In Ghana, they secured one of these loans with the export of cocoa. In Ethiopia, they secured a loan with the export of sesame seeds. So for the Chinese, these loans are not some desperate way to lock up oil resources or natural minerals of some kind. They're a way to provide credit and get work for Chinese companies and allow African governments that don't have a lot of cash to pay for it. Now, on hearing about one of these deals, which was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that we used to call Zaire, the Financial Times wrote, Beijing has thrown down its most direct challenge yet to the West's architecture for aiding African development. And I think that this editor was right. Now, China's interest in Africa is very real, but I think it's not as big as we sometimes think, and I'll give you some dimensions of that. And it does present some concerns. So those of you that have thought about this and been worried about it, there are some important areas where those concerns are very real. One is in environmental areas, for example, forestry. Chinese companies are actively exporting unprocessed timber from Africa, often in situations where this is illegal according to local laws. And they're doing it with the connivance of local companies in Gabon, Tanzania, Mozambique. This is an issue. Ivory. As the Chinese rise in their wealth and their middle class, ivory has become a status symbol. It's not just China. You can see this in Vietnam, Thailand, but consumption of ivory has been on a sharp rise, and this is a worry. The Chinese manufacture small arms, as they manufacture so many other things, and these are somewhat regulated, but they are something that helps to fuel conflicts and small-scale conflicts around the continent. This is a reality. And China's rise has made it difficult for the United States to try to broker some of the more intractable conflicts in Africa. Sudan is one example there. Zimbabwe is another. But as we can learn more, perhaps in the Q&A period, China's role has been changing, particularly in Sudan. And I think in 2008, there was a turnaround. And now the United States advisors who are working on the Sudan issue have remarked on how China's role there has become much more pragmatic and much more helpful to our goals, which has been to try to get peace in that area. And they're doing it out of their own interests, but they realize that their interests include a peaceful and stable Sudan and South Sudan, so they're getting involved diplomatically. Now, Africans also have a lot of concerns. And they're concerned about Chinese goods flooding into their markets and really contributing in some sectors to deindustrialization. This is particularly acute in the textile sector, which is one of the early manufacturing sectors in any developing country. People start producing cotton and fabric and start making clothes. And so the textile sectors in Africa have been largely antiquated. They haven't been modernized. They haven't been updated. And so when Chinese textiles started flooding into Africa, it put these industries at a severe disadvantage. They've been going out of business across the continent. So that's a concern. On the other hand, Chinese companies, very interestingly, have been moving some of their manufacturing to Africa. I've been looking at this in Ethiopia, where Chinese companies have been moving into the leather sector. Ethiopia has the largest number of cattle and sheep and goats of any country in Africa. And this may mean that they have one of the largest numbers in the world. And they don't add much value. They export a lot of sheep and goats to the Middle East, where they're consumed, and they have their own cattle, which people there in the tribal areas don't like to slaughter the cattle because it's a store of wealth. But there is a small, developing, modern leather industry in Ethiopia, and it was started by the Italians when they briefly occupied Ethiopia around World War II. Now, what is happening in China, and how this makes sense, is that the cost of production in China is going up. And so as those costs rise, for example, labor costs in China are going up at about 17% per year. So we think of China as a cheap labor place. That's no longer going to be the case. And right now it's along the coast, in the coastal areas where manufacturing is most developed, but it's spreading inland and other areas. And it's in part the Chinese government wants this to happen. They're playing a delicate balance between trying to move China up the value scale so that they will go into less labor-intensive activities and more capital-intensive activities, because that's where the profits are. And they see that. That's what we've done. That's what Europe has done. That's what they're doing as well. And so this means if you are in a labor-intensive sector, like shoes, like garments, like early-stage manufacturing, furniture, all of these areas, you're going to find it's not going to be profitable anymore. So Chinese companies are moving offshore, just as our companies did. Now, they can't move to China, obviously. Although they can move west. But then China's so large, the transport costs become high. So they're moving to Vietnam, they're moving to Bangladesh, they're moving to Indonesia, and some of them are coming to Africa, which gets us back to Ethiopia. I have a research project in the leather sector in Ethiopia. And what I found is that Chinese companies are setting up factories. They're buying the Ethiopian leather, hides, and skins. They're processing them to a higher standard, and then they're making shoes out of them. So I visited one factory in Ethiopia where it was a picture of globalization. You had Ethiopian workers supervised by Chinese, and there were Brazilians walking up and down the aisles monitoring the quality, because they were having shoes made by that factory that used to be made in Brazil and in China, and they're exporting them to the United States. That's globalization. And moreover, it's not just the Chinese that are moving in. Japanese, Italians, British, and German companies are coming into the leather sector. And they're not coming from Germany. They're coming from China. So they had already offshored to China, and now they're moving into Ethiopia. And what was striking to me about this was that there wasn't a single American company in the leather sector yet. So this will get back to some of the things that I think we should be doing better than we are. Now, Africans are also concerned about Chinese shopkeepers coming in. And there are quite a few. When the communists took over in 1949, they stopped people leaving China. It became very hard. You had to escape. You could come across the border in Hong Kong, you could swim to Macau, but it was hard to get out. And so the Chinese diaspora that had been going out before that, the Chinese that had come and set up all the Chinatowns in New York and other parts of our country, they're also all around Europe, Africa, Latin America. There's a Chinese restaurant in probably every major city and most towns all over the world. That all stopped in 1949. And now, with the relaxation of immigration in China, the Chinese are coming out again. So this is not a government push to push people out because they have so many at home. It's a natural emigration that's happening. And so you find a lot of shopkeepers, people coming to Africa who were not necessarily shopkeepers in China, but it's an easy entry sector. And so you find them setting up shops and they're competing with Africans at a lower level. And Africans are not used to this from non-Africans. They are used to it from other Africans. For example, in South Africa, the little shops are often run by Somalians. And so if you're in a township, you might say, let's run down to the Somali shop and buy something. In Liberia, Sheriff, you go there, you'll find the little shops are often run by Mandinkas. And they're not from Liberia. They're from Guinea and Senegal. And so they run the Mandinka shops, and so on. In Sierra Leone, it's the Fula shops, and they aren't from Sierra Leone either. So there is a phenomenon of people from outside of your country running these little commercial activities. But it's usually been Africans, or maybe Lebanese. In some parts of Africa, it was Indians. And they've all been there a long time. So people are quite used to that. But they haven't been Chinese until very recently. And now they are. There is a Chinese shop, I would hazard to say, in any significant sized town across the continent now. You can find a Chinese shop, and it's a concern. At the same time, Africans appreciate the opportunity to buy things at cheaper prices than they had to pay before. But what I hear most about in Africa is labor relations. And you can imagine, Chinese companies come there. And there's this idea that they bring all their own workers. That's not true. There are a few cases, a few countries, Algeria, Libya, Angola, and Sudan, where there are a lot of Chinese workers. All of these are oil-rich countries building a lot of infrastructure and wanting it to be done quickly, so they allowed the Chinese to bring in their own workers. Almost everywhere else, you'll find it's 80% or more local workers. And so therefore, it becomes a labor relations issue and conflicts between supervisors and workers. Chinese companies are not used to unions. So African countries are, and African workers are unionized. So they've had to deal with that. And Chinese are used to people working 8 hours a day, and then they say, overtime starts in another 4 hours. Or 2 hours. And of course, you work on Saturday and maybe on Sunday. So that's what they're used to in China, where people, by and large, they're starting to resist having to work so hard like that. But often people have embraced the opportunity to make more money. There's a saying in China, 吃苦. It means eat bitterness. And the idea is that we will work hard in our lifetime so that our children can have an easier life. And now they're not having to 吃苦 so much anymore, and children are having an easier life than their parents did. But in Africa, they're still expecting, these people are so poor, these countries are so poor, surely they must want to 吃苦 and work hard and work overtime the way we do in China in order to prosper. And that's not necessarily the decision that's being made by African workers. So there are conflicts in a lot of areas there. So that's what I hear about. And I can give you a lot of examples of those conflicts or the number of African workers working for Chinese companies if you're interested. But I think the greatest challenge is that we have tended to deal with Africa as a place of war and pathos, child soldiers, diseases, and a place that needs our help and our pity, rather than a place for investment. And I think that our aid has been focused on that. Our aid has been systematically delinked from investment. We don't want our aid to help create opportunities for American companies. We don't want our aid necessarily to go into manufacturing so it could compete with us. In fact, there are rules about that that Congress has placed on the United States Agency for International Development. They cannot help any country create a job, a manufacturing, for example, if it might take a job from America. And it's politics, of course we understand that. But yet manufacturing is what these poor countries need to do. They need to go into that in order to create jobs for people. And so we have not been focused on job creation in the way that we engage with Africa. We've helped a lot through our aid program to keep Africans alive. The majority of our aid goes into health, but we're not thinking about what are they going to do now that they've had the gift of being able to sustain their lives. So Africa is rich. The continent is full of resources, and we know that. And so much of it is yet unexplored. But we haven't figured out a way to link Africa's resources to its development. And the Chinese are actively trying to do just that. And if we think again back to that example of Japan and China, we can see some of how that's working. Now, the Chinese ambassador in Niger had an interesting statement about how they're thinking. He said, you know, the French have been in Niger for more than 40 years. And Niger is not very well developed. In fact, the French have been in the uranium industry. They dominate it. And Niger's revenues from uranium every year are about the same as their revenues from the export of onions. So he said, we think we can do better at that. We can help the Nigerians to add more value to their local raw materials. Now, there are a number of myths about the Chinese in Africa. I've already talked about some of them, and I'm going to go into about 5 more, depending on how much time I have. And the first is that China is a newcomer in Africa. So a lot of people who know that the Chinese are there think that they just arrived recently because they're desperate for Africa's natural resources. And that's actually not the case. And I think knowing something about the evolution of this relationship can help us to understand how it works today and how it's going to work in the future. So let me show you a little bit about that history. Here's Ming Dynasty China. During the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese actually had an ocean-going fleet of what we would call junks, the Chinese ships. And they were headed by this gentleman you see up there. His name was Zheng He. He was an admiral of the Chinese Navy, and he was a Muslim, and he was a eunuch. So he was a very interesting fellow. And he was very well respected by the emperor. So Zheng He was in charge of this ocean-going fleet. And they went around the coast of China, they went through Southeast Asia, they went around the coast of India, and they did this multiple times. And on a few of those voyages, they got as far as Africa. So they landed in the area around Mogadishu, they came down to Zanzibar, which is now part of Tanzania. They probably landed in Kenya, in Lamu, in that area, if any of you have visited that. And it's said they might have gotten all the way down to Mozambique. So they did this during the Ming Dynasty in the 1500s. And then China changed and turned inward. But one of the things the Chinese are proud of saying is that they took nothing from Africa except some plants, some specimens of different kinds, and a giraffe for the emperor to admire. And it actually made it all the way back to Beijing. So this is the size of the boats that came from China. I don't know if you can see this, I guess. The really large boat in the back is the size of the Chinese boat. And there's a little tiny boat in front, which is the size of the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. So you can see the scale. And not only that, there were dozens of these boats. So they came not just with 3, but with dozens. And I can only imagine what it must have been like to be on the island of Lamu and see these 36 huge boats coming up over the horizon and sailing in to your harbor. But then they did go back. China turned inward. And they were not to come to Africa again until after the colonial period was ending. And so Mao Zedong and the other Chinese communists made common cause with the socialist countries emerging from the colonial period in Africa. And so they were friendly with Algeria, they were friendly with Zambia, they were friendly with Tanzania, Guinea, Mali, all of whom had socialist leaders at the first period after the colonial period ended. And you can see some of the examples of how the Chinese sent their aid programs. And they did. They had aid programs across the continent. And they did this in part because of the diplomatic battle with Taiwan. So, as you may know, the United States recognized Taiwan as China until 1971. And so Taiwan sat in the United Nations. We had our embassy in Taiwan. And China was just on the outskirts, on the outside. They didn't have a seat at the United Nations. Beijing didn't. We just said Taiwan is China. And in Beijing, this huge country, they were saying, actually, we're China. They're a little island. But they had to get the votes of other countries at the United Nations in order to regain that seat. And they regained that seat only in 1971. And it was the votes of African countries that got them in. And so the Chinese appreciate that, even today. And they showed their appreciation, or one might say they eased those decisions by providing foreign aid. And so by 1975, after they had been voted in, they had aid programs in more countries in Africa than the United States did. And you can see how that happened, because it was the Cold War. But the Chinese were in the position they could give aid to socialist countries or countries fighting Western proxies in Africa. And they could also give aid to the non-socialist countries, which they befriended in order to get into the United Nations. So their aid had a practical, political, and diplomatic component. That was the majority of why they gave it. And some of you may be thinking now, oh, I think I remember the Tanzam Railway, which the Chinese built in Africa. I see a few people's heads nodding. In the early 1970s. It was a huge railway. It was an enormous engineering feat. And this is something that people in Africa still remember with great appreciation, how the Chinese built a railway so that Zambia could export its copper, not to China. They were exporting it to the West. But so they didn't have to go through South Africa, which was controlled by the apartheid government. And they didn't want to be at the beck and call of the apartheid government that could control their exports. So I first went to Africa, as I said, in the 1980s, and I was doing research on the Chinese, and they were there. But nobody else was really looking. You had to go up country, you had to go to agricultural projects, you had to go to the little hydropower projects that they were building, or see a road somewhere that was under construction. And most people just didn't pay any attention to it. The Cold War was not really about China so much as about the Soviet Union. So in the 1980s, they were there. In the 1990s, it started to grow, the relationship. And they experimented a lot with how to develop commercial relations in Africa, because they hadn't a lot of experience with that. But Africa was a good testing ground for China. Chinese goods, Chinese machinery was cheap, and Africans could afford it, whereas it wasn't going to find a market yet in America. So Chinese presidents went to Africa. And this map here, all of the countries in gray, it shows countries that were visited by Chinese presidents or premiers, who was essentially their vice president. So each one of the gray countries was visited at least once by a Chinese leader after 1995. And some of the countries were visited up to 4 times. But it wasn't the resource-rich countries necessarily. Angola, for example, just got 1 visit. Morocco got 4. Mali got 2. And South Africa got 4. So there were countries that were visited for political reasons as well as for natural resources. So all of this goes to say that the Chinese are not new in Africa, that their relationship has important political and diplomatic foundations, and that they've been increasing that engagement in the last decades from a fairly low base, but gradually every year it's been growing and growing and growing. And so when it popped into our attention about maybe 8 or 10 years ago, it had been going up and going up from a very low base, and suddenly it became visible. So the second myth, I think, is that we think China is only in Africa to extract resources. Now, let me say first and foremost, I do think that resources is the most important objective overall for the Chinese in Africa. But they're no different in that than any of the other countries that are very active in Africa. The United States, the European countries, Japan, and so on. And that's partly because of the structure of African economies. What do they have to trade? It's natural resources and commodities that are largely unprocessed. So that's not a situation the Chinese created. That's what they found when they got there, and that's what they're responding to. But there's a whole lot more to it than that. So I mentioned the strategic diplomacy that got the Chinese into the United Nations. That's still important. And it's important because there are 50 countries in Africa. Each country has a vote. So when the Chinese have an issue that's important to them, they can call on their African friends and say, would you support us on this issue? And it's not just the United Nations, it's also the World Trade Organization. So most African countries are also members at the WTO. And so when the WTO is making decisions about China, they can get a consensus of their friends in Africa to help support their position, and in other international organizations as well. So the strategic diplomacy and the sheer number of countries in Africa helps China. Now, you can see that this is the case because the kind of political engagement that they have in in Africa, is also something that you find in the Caribbean. And why are they interested in the Caribbean? They don't have natural resources to speak of there, but they have so many individual countries, tiny ones, all with a vote. And in the South Pacific, again, some resources, but mainly not significant for the Chinese economy, but votes. And so that kind of relationship is important. So we can see it matters about Taiwan. They don't want the Taiwanese to come back in. It matters about things like Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and then other things that happen at the United Nations more generally. But business is also critical for the Chinese. And again, it's not just about the natural resources, although, as we'll see, if we look at exports to Africa from China, you can see how it's grown here from 2000, which is a small amount, all the way up to today's figures, where total trade is over $200 billion. So it was about 20 billion in 2000. So it's become very, very large. And this is the United States. So in terms of exports to Africa, in 2000, our exports were double Chinese exports. And then now by 2010, it was exactly the opposite. So their exports were double ours. So they are really increasing their market share in Africa very rapidly. And Africans are buying Chinese goods. They're buying them on the cheap end, and they're buying them on the more expensive end as well. So across all the different categories of goods, they're coming from China. Now, imports from Africa. The Chinese are importing a lot, and it's about 85 to 90% raw materials. But the United States has been importing even more. And ours is also about 85 to 90% raw materials, mainly oil. And that's been reduced because of our own oil revolution here and the natural gas revolution. So we are more proportionately dependent on Africa's natural resources than the Chinese. Now, one of the things that we don't see is infrastructure. Now, Africa, according to the World Bank, should be spending about $90 billion a year on infrastructure. $90 billion. And they're only spending about half of that, This picture is from Liberia, and it shows after the war what happened to bridges. And you can see this across the continent. Now, about 12% of the roads in Africa are paved. That makes it very difficult. If you have 88% of the roads unpaved and you have a rainy season, it makes it very difficult to get up. And I can remember in West Africa when I was there as a student, sitting at the base of a hill, which was a road that was red mud, and the rain pouring down, and a whole group of trucks and buses waiting there to see how they could try to get up that hill in the mud. And some would try, and they would get stuck in the ruts. So it's like that in a lot of countries. So the Chinese have been paving a lot of those roads. In fact, they've paved 60,000 kilometers of roads in Africa since 2000, according to their figures. And this is a picture I took in Tanzania, where they're paving one of the roads. And this is actually being paid by the Tanzanian government, who's commissioned the Chinese company to do that. There's a lot of other areas in which infrastructure needs to improve in Africa. For example, that same World Bank study said that the 800 million people of sub-Saharan Africa are generating about as much electricity as Spain, who has 45 million people. So that's an incredible shortage of electricity. And that makes it very difficult to be part of the modern world if you don't have electricity to power your laptop and engage with the rest of the world. And irrigation. Africa has a food shortage. They're the largest area that's importing food, and yet the continent is rich in arable resources and water resources. But most of the water just runs through in the rainy season into the rivers and out to the oceans. They don't store the water for irrigation. Only about 3% of the area that could be irrigated is irrigated in Africa. So all of these provide opportunities, and Chinese companies are taking advantage of them. They're building hydropower with some of those rivers, not as much as a lot of people believe, but there have been about 17 over 100 megawatt large hydropower projects, which is a renewable energy resource built by Chinese companies. They're also building just buildings. The face of African cities looks different now because Chinese companies have been there. And when we look at the contracts that they're getting to build all this infrastructure, it's at $40 billion a year. So the deficit is Africa needs about $90 billion, $90 billion a year, and the Chinese are building about $40 billion of that. So that's a huge area of business for them. And the Chinese government is not paying for most of this. Most of this is being paid for by African governments themselves, private individuals who are commissioning Chinese work, or the African Development Bank, the World Bank, even the Americans through our Millennium Challenge Corporation. We've commissioned a lot of this work. And the kinds of infrastructure I've mentioned are complemented by things like fiber optic networks and telecommunications. You may have some idea about how Africa's joined the cell phone revolution. And if you go through the continent, there are very few places where you can go now where there isn't some kind of cell phone reception. And Africans that are illiterate are using cell phones to find prices for their crops so that they can get a better deal. And this is really changing things. They're using cell phones to send money back and forth without going through banks. So it's really remarkable. And those cell phones they're using are made in China, and the infrastructure, the cell phone towers are put up by Chinese companies. So that's a whole nother area of Chinese engagement. So I mentioned the financing. What about investment? We hear a lot about the level of investment of China in Africa. At least I hear a lot about it. I'm not sure you do. But this is an area that's very difficult to figure out. We do have good figures from the Chinese, and this compares the Chinese and the United States. So the blue line here is the United States, and you can see in every year compared to the red, United States investment in Africa has been a lot higher. But I'll tell you why it's difficult to track the Chinese figures. And it's not because there's some deviousness going on or they're trying to hide something. It's because of the structure of their economy. So this is a lecture on finance and economics, right? So let me give you a little bit of a lecture on that. China has a closed economy in many ways. They're open for trade, but when we look at things like investment, capital, it's closed. So the Chinese currency is not convertible. We see now our government's putting pressure on them to make their currency convertible, but they still have a lot of controls. They control their exchange rate, and they control capital movements in and out because that affects the exchange rate, and they want to keep an eye on it. Now, if you control your capital flows in and out, and you have companies that want to invest overseas, every time they want to invest, they have to go through a huge amount of paperwork. They have to get a license. They have to go through all of this rigmarole. So what do? As soon as they get their capital overseas, or they have a company overseas, they keep it overseas. And where do they keep it? The number one place is Hong Kong, because for the Chinese economy, Hong Kong is still considered outside of China. So they put their money in Hong Kong, and then it can go anywhere. And it can't really be tracked as Chinese because so many others use Hong Kong. We can't see if money coming from a bank in Hong Kong is Chinese or it's American or European. It's not identifiable any longer. But the blue area in this table is Hong Kong. But the other two areas where the Chinese send a lot of their capital, Chinese companies, is the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. So if you look at where Chinese foreign investment goes, it goes first to Hong Kong, second to the British Virgin Islands, third to the Cayman Islands. And it's not as though you go to those places and you find big Chinese mines or oil rigs. It's just sitting there until a company which is registered there can send it someplace else. Now, our companies do that too, and we don't like it because these are low tax or no tax locations, and it's a way to beat the tax man. And the Chinese have some of those goals as well on taxation, but mostly they just want to be able to move freely, which they can't if they keep their money in Beijing or Shanghai. And so this makes it difficult to track where that money goes. So my guess is that the investment is a lot larger than the official figures, but we can only guess it because we can see it coming from the BVIs or from Hong Kong, but we don't know for sure that it's Chinese. Now, again, when we're looking at Chinese investment, you might think that China's largest investment in Africa would be a copper mine or an oil well or something along those lines. But it's not. Does anyone have any idea what their largest investment would be? Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of thinking going on. Their largest investment is actually 20% of a bank in South Africa. So they bought 20% of South Africa's Standard Bank for $5.4 billion. That's one transaction. And why did they do that? Why did they buy 20% of an African bank? Think back on the infrastructure, because infrastructure is such an important business sector for them, and they want to understand that better, and they want to be able to put together bigger and better deals in the infrastructure sector because they see it's growing. Africa is on the move, and in order to continue to be on the move, they need their infrastructure to be better. And so there's going to be a huge amount of business for Chinese companies, and they want to partner with an African bank that knows that market, and they can learn from them. And that's exactly why they did that, and it's working. Now, another thing that we hear often is that Chinese aid is huge in Africa. And this is part of my own special expertise. And it's something that I see a lot. And I see a lot of people, because the Chinese are not transparent about this. They don't publish their aid figures country by country or continent by continent. And so I've seen estimates of Chinese aid. The Christian Science Monitor had an article, and they said that Chinese aid was 3 times the amount coming from the West altogether. And I've seen in the Wall Street Journal an op-ed by some people that work at Rand Corporation, and they said China had given Africa in, I think it was 2011, they gave them $80 billion in aid in just 1 year. So what some of these figures do is they put together media reports, and they don't really distinguish between different kinds of Chinese activities. One group said everything that's connected to the government, we'll just call it aid, which is a little odd because China has a lot of state-owned companies. So if you have an oil company going in and making an investment, why would you call that aid? It's a little different than most aid activities. It's not subsidized, it's a commercial investment. And so if we look at Chinese aid and we call it aid the same way we call our own activities aid, we use the same definition and we put the activities that they do according to that definition together, and we compare them with what we do and what Europe does and Japan, we find their official aid is fairly small. And so I did that, and their official aid in 2012 was about just under $3 billion to Africa. So that's a lot smaller than $80 billion. And if you put all of the European aid together, it's about $15 billion. If you put the United States aid together for the continent, it's about $10 billion. And so Chinese aid is still pretty small. And this is the aid that goes into poverty reduction, health, building schools, some roads and things like this. And it's subsidized, it's concessional, or it's a grant. So all those things are under aid. Now, there's some other reasons why we think Chinese aid is so big, and it's because they have an export credit agency, as we do. And theirs is called China Exim Bank. We have our own Exim Bank, and there's a lot of discussion right now in Washington, where I live, about whether or not we should continue to have an export credit agency, our export bank. I am firmly on the side that says we must, because what we're doing is we're helping our companies find markets in places where the buyers can't finance the purchase. So these are big deals. We want them to be able to pay for it over time. They can't find the finance. Commercial banks are probably not going to make these loans. And it's helpful for us and for our economy and our businesses to have an export credit agency. And we can see what the Chinese are doing. Their export credit agency is huge. It's by far the largest in the entire world. And it finances that business in Africa. And so a lot of the aid that we think is coming from China is actually these export credits that are financing the purchase of Chinese tractors and Chinese machinery and Chinese exports. Now, this is a picture of Chinese aid, country by country, year by year, and it's all the aid agreements, just with a dot there. So what's interesting about this picture is that there are some big white areas. Those white areas represent years in which an African country had diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So, and down in this area are years in which that country had recognized Taiwan. It's before they recognized China, so that area is all white. Now, what does this say to me? It's that aid from China is a lot about politics. And so it's about diplomacy, and it's spread very evenly across the continent. And if you look at the figures behind this chart, you will see that it's not that different. If a country has a lot of natural resources, they don't get proportionately more aid from China. It's because the aid is not that big and it's spread around largely for diplomatic reasons. That's not true of business, of course. And one of the countries that gets a lot of business from China is Burkina Faso. What do we know about Burkina Faso? You probably don't know very much. I don't even know very much about Burkina Faso, and I've never been there. But I do know two things. One, Burkina Faso recognizes Taiwan. It's one of 4 countries in Africa that still don't have diplomatic ties with Beijing. But number 2, Burkina Faso is the largest supplier of cotton to China. So the commercial relations continue to be very important, even though the diplomatic ties are completely absent. Now, another area in which you might have heard some things about China is this idea that China is leading the land grab in Africa. And this is something that I'm writing a book about right now. So it's my next book is going to be on this. And I think the general impression is the Chinese government is leading land acquisition to grow food to send back to China. And none of that is actually the case. There's almost no food going from Africa to China. There are things like sesame seeds and cocoa, these kinds of commodities, but not things like rice and wheat and corn and so on. The Chinese government is not doing very much. The companies that would like to invest keep saying we're getting no help from our government. And the food that's going from abroad into China is largely coming from Latin America, in particular from Brazil. There's an idea that the Chinese government orchestrates so much of what happens in Africa. But when I'm there, companies tell me their stories. And they say, for example, in one of the largest deals, I interviewed the companies, and rather than Beijing coming in and forming this whole deal, this guy told me, he said, it was our idea. We talked to the government in the Congo about this, how we could do more infrastructure work, and they said, maybe you can pay for it you can develop a mine. And they said, we're a construction company. What do we know about mining? But, well, they had this old mine, and they said, if you can get that back online, we can export copper, and then that can pay for a line of credit, and we can do a lot of construction business. So 2 Chinese construction companies put together what at the time was a $6 billion deal. And then with the Congolese, they went to Beijing and tried to get finance for it. And they were successful. So it was all the companies themselves that put this together. Now, there are contrasts between the way we look at Africa and the way the Chinese do. And I think I've mentioned a lot of those already. But we look at Africa and we believe that countries need aid and good governance to develop. And we think that our aid is driven by altruism. There's a lot of self-interest in our aid, but still. And we believe that conditionality imposed on things like aid can improve governance. And we believe that Africa needs to be saved. That's a general, I'm giving a caricature of our foreign policy there. But there's a lot of truth there in how we think about it. The Chinese are very different. They believe that countries need investment and infrastructure to develop, because that's their experience in their developing country. And they believe that aid is about diplomacy, which I've been saying. And they think that governance improves slowly as a result of the economy developing. And they think Africa is very interesting for business. I think the Africa Summit showed that the United States is starting to shift more towards the Chinese view of Africa, and I think that's interesting. Now, there are some things that shock us about how the Chinese engage. For example, in Sudan, the Chinese use their official aid budget to build a presidential residence for the president, and he's under indictment by the International Criminal Court. That's shocking. I'm shocked by it. But when we think about how their aid is about diplomacy, it makes sense for them to build the White House for an African president, because each African president going into that White House is going to be looking at it as a gift from China. That makes a lot of sense diplomatically. Now, they are shocked by some of what we do. For example, people working for the World Bank fly off to Africa, first class or business class, and they stay in 5-star hotels, and that's paid for out of the aid budget that we contribute. So the Chinese are shocked because this is how their aid experts live in very simple accommodations in Africa, and ours are living in 5-star hotels. So I think the last thing that I want to say is that the Chinese are on a learning curve in Africa, and I think that that's a good thing, and I think they're going to learn very quickly. So this is an example of Yao Ming, the famous Chinese basketball player. He's leading a movement now in China to try to shift how the Chinese think about ivory and to try to make ivory as a negative association as possible. And so, yeah, that's a great thing. So they're on a learning curve, and I think the solutions to some of these problems will be coming over time. So let me end with this picture and it goes along with the saying by two Washington Post reporters who said that exaggerating the threat from China might be just as dangerous as underestimating it. And I do think there is a bit of the Fu Manchu idea that we have. So I'll end with a picture of my book. Thank you very much.
You can submit your questions to your usher to bring it forward, or you can also submit it by using Twitter with the hashtag ASKCHQ. And I'm distracted by the noise, so I would ask you, please, if you have other obligations, please leave quietly. I think Professor Bräutigam will also be distracted by that noise. We have some questions already from Twitter. There is reluctance to, this is an assumption, there's a reluctance to invest in Africa due to corruption or instability. Which African countries are reliable for investment?
I think I should set up a consulting firm and maybe answer that question professionally. I think there are a number of countries that are really open for investment and where corruption is not as big a problem as it is in others. Ethiopia is a really good example. Rwanda, surprisingly, is getting hugely good ratings in terms of its investment climate. They aren't still getting a lot of investment. And there are places where there are niche areas for investment. And I think if you look, certainly Kenya is still a good place. It's getting a lot of investment. South Africa is getting a lot of investment. And even Nigeria, surprisingly, huge problems with corruption, but they have areas in which their economy is growing and there's increasing investment in the infrastructure sectors and manufacturing there. So there are a number of other places as well, but it really depends on what sector you're looking at. And I think that there's a lot that Americans are not seeing, and it's interesting that even the Europeans are ahead of us in this regard.
Can you talk about China's influence on African education? For example, are they building schools in Africa? Are they funding African students to study at Chinese universities?
Oh, that's a great question. As part of their pledges in one of their Africa summits in 2006, the Chinese pledged to build, I think it was 300 primary schools across Africa. And so they've got, most countries have gotten up to 3 or more of these primary schools. And they're all equipped with all of the latest kind of technologies that are appropriate for the context where they are. I've noticed one thing about these schools is that usually at least one of them is located near the president's hometown of that country. So again, how the aid and the politics work together. Now, but I don't think that's going to affect education that much in Africa. There are a couple of other things that they're doing. And one is that they are now offering university scholarships to about 7,000 Africans every year to study for free in China. And so that's a lot more than we're offering, at least at the government level. We certainly offer scholarships at the private level at private universities, ours does and others, and we don't have any figures on that for America. But the Chinese engagement in African higher level education is quite intense. And there are many, if you go to China, you'll see many Africans at the universities there. And they're studying a range of subjects. They don't control what it is that they study. And some are studying at the graduate level and through the PhD.
Will China try to make the yuan the reserve currency in Africa?
The Chinese move gradually in most areas, and the convertibility of the yuan and making the yuan an important global currency is on the way. And one of the ways they're doing it is by having currency swaps and other arrangements country by country. So I don't think they'll sort of do that for the continent of Africa, but they will be experimenting there as in other areas where it makes sense for the trade relationship to be denominated more in yuan. For example, right now, it doesn't really make sense for the Chinese to export in dollars and then convert back into something being sold in South African rand. You lose on each of those transactions. So it makes a lot more sense that they can come to an exchange rate between the rand and the yuan and then just do that directly. So that's more what they're trying to do.
What happened in 2009 that affected all the graphs in the in your graphs in the economy?
The global financial crisis. China's part of the global economy, and so it hit Chinese companies. And there's so many investments that I've been tracking where the investor in 2009 said, whoa, I just had to stop. I couldn't do what I wanted to because of my business back in China was hit. So I just didn't have the capital I thought I was going to have to make an investment in Africa.
Charities and missionaries have engaged African countries for better or worse, this person on Twitter says. How does that compare with Chinese engagement?
It's so different. I have relatives who are missionaries in India, not in Africa. And I actually think that missionaries have done a wonderful job. And I think we've moved away from that. We've kind of substituted foreign aid in a way for a lot of our missionary engagement in the past, and NGOs. And I think the missions were different from the NGOs in that the NGOs sort of come and go. They don't necessarily stay in the same place for decades and decades and decades. And what the missions did was two things that were particularly important. They built schools and operated them, and they built hospitals and operated them. So that's still happening. But we have a whole lot of other activities in which we're putting our charitable contributions, and those are all the NGO activities, which some are a lot less sustainable than these. And there are so many African leaders in our generation, speaking broadly for all of us, who were educated in mission schools in Africa. And those were really important contributions to building the foundation of leadership there.
Several questions about corruption and how that affects trade and whether China's investments are more successful dealing with corruption in Africa, and also about unrest. So I'll let you combine those two ideas and answer that question.
I think you can combine those two. From the Chinese perspective, if they look at their own development experience, there's a lot of corruption. And they recognize that. And the new leadership in China has been trying to crack down more on corruption, although there's still a lot of road to go on that. But what they see is that it's not corruption that stops development from happening. They look around Asia. Leaders in Japan, Taiwan, Korea have all been indicted for corruption. And yet, those economies are all fairly robust. And strong and well developed. So the Chinese say, well, it's not corruption that's stopping development from happening, at least not the way we have it in Asia. And so they say it's political stability that you need. So having political stability and an investment environment where people know they can invest and they can invest for the future. And so if there's a 10% payoff that has to happen, they're certainly willing to do that. Now, of course, corruption where it's 100%, you're not getting anything on either side. So the Chinese, they're different in how they approach that. We are very concerned about corruption. The United States has led this global march against corruption, and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But it took us decades to get Europe to join with us. So we passed a law in 1997 against foreign corruption practices, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It wasn't until 1997 that Europe joined with us in a convention against corruption through the OECD in Paris. And so it's going to take a lot longer to get the Chinese to join that as well. But I think we should recognize that first of all, development can happen in corrupt contexts. But that there has to be the stability that allows it to happen. And second, that it's an evolution to improve governance. And corruption is one part of that.
Does Chinese investment help develop an African middle class, or is it Chinese managers and Africans in menial jobs?
It depends. The longer a Chinese company is present in an African country, the more their employment at all levels becomes African. And this is purely for economics. As they train people, as people move up the hierarchy in a factory or in a construction company, they become confident. And as the Chinese company learns the local language, they realize they can communicate better. They don't need to have people at the management hierarchy who speak Chinese. It just makes economic sense because the Chinese are expensive. Imagine, you have to pay every 18 months, you have to send someone back on home leave, you have to, at the management level, for most companies, you have to pay their airfare, you have to pay their housing, you have to pay their food, and you have to pay an allowance for them. And you have to have an incentive package to bring them to Africa in the first place, because it's not the preferred place to come and work. All of that's very costly. And so if you can hire someone locally, it's by far to be preferred. And that's what the companies do. So the longer they're there, the higher they go. I was just writing, actually, a couple days ago about one of the Chinese farms I've been studying. They've been in Africa since 2000, so that's about 14 years now. And they have, when I visited them, they had about 1,000 Africans working there, and there were 2 Chinese. They actually employ 6 Chinese, but 4 of them were away. So they actually have a very small number of Chinese. And that's typical.
Someone takes a cue from one of your slides and starts the question, once upon a time. 1970s, for example, we worried about the role of Soviets and Castro in Africa. What happened to them?
The Soviets. Well, that's a good question. Soviets are kind of absent in Africa. I suppose at some point we might have a Russia summit of African leaders, but the Russians have their own oil, so that's interesting. They're a very large country. They have a lot of natural resources of their own. So the complementarity between the Russian economy and the African economies just isn't there. Whereas we're a manufactured country and services, and so there is complementarity there. So for the Russians, the Cold War is over. They don't really have diplomatic needs that strongly to be in Africa, although that might be something that would bring them back if they wanted, if this thing with Putin and us continues to escalate. They might want that diplomatic support, but what can they offer?
I'm going to let you choose your last question because there are so many great ones here, but I'm going to give you a choice of 3. One is, if you look forward 10 to 20 years, what will be China's economic relationship with Africa? Your second choice, how much interest are you finding in the United States government regarding increasing our involvement in Africa? And the third is, what are the Chinese doing for women in Africa?
I'm going to be very quick and answer all 3. For women, very little specifically, but as you know, the Chinese have this idea that women hold up half the sky, and so their approach is basically they don't discriminate against women. So, and I do see that. There are lots of Chinese women working in Africa. And also, the students that are coming off to study in China, there are quite a few women as well. In terms of the what China will look like in Africa in the next 20 years, I think it'll look a lot like Japan in Southeast Asia, which is a lot of close commercial ties, a lot of investment, and dynamism in the engagement. So I think it's going to be diversified. And what was the last question? Oh, yes, the United States does see this. And I talk to people a lot. I speak at the Foreign Service Institute training our diplomats regularly, and I give them the same kind of lecture. And I think they really are getting the picture, and I'm so pleased that the Africa Summit seems to be reflecting that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Deborah Bräutigam.